In the previous lesson, we introduced media screens, and we saw how it works on different size screens. So with media screens, you can actually add as many as needed. So if I want to set another breakpoint at 1200 pics, then I could do that as well. And the really interesting thing about this is that if we're building from a mobile perspective, this is where I need to set my maximum width. So I don't want to have my maximum width there, but I do want to have my border. I want to have it centered. So I'm going to leave those properties up there, and I'm going to go down here and add in wrapper and update my maximum width. So basically what's going to happen now, whenever I shrink or whenever I resize it, we see that whenever that screen size gets past the 1200 pixel point, then that's when my maximum width takes effect. So before that, we're sitting at 100% across, so it's taking up that 100% available width. So here I can actually update this to be max width, and we'll set it at 100%. And this was just to ensure that we are getting that full width across. So anything less than a 1200 pix screen is going to be a full 100% across. So let's add in some additional styling here. And as we can see from our original design, I'm just going to shrink it down so we can see what's happening with the website and how the layout is going to be changing as we're updating the CSS. Because now we're working on the bigger screen, so it's a little bit harder to see there. So let's take a look at this and see that, okay, so this is what we want it to look like for mobile, but we want it to look different when we're presenting it within our larger screens. And what we want to do is we want to actually float our main content, our navigation menu, over to the left. So this is where I'm going to apply that property of float. So float left. And we can see that it gets pulled over here to the left hand side. And we need to specify that I want to give it a width of 20%. Because we don't want to take up that full available width. And maybe I also want to add in some borders around there, just so that it's more visible. So that's all of our sections there. So we see that this is where the nav is falling, and we see that's pulled over to the left hand side. And with the nav, you don't really see it done horizontally when it's pulled over to the left hand side. And this is where we want to actually stack the list items to be displayed block. So we're going to get rid of that small screen where we're stacking them horizontally, and here we're just going to stack them vertically, and right away we get a nice stacking of our block there. So we can add in some padding as well. So let's add in 10 pics and maybe add in 20 pics. So that presents us with a nice neat menu, and let's take up width of 100% just to make sure that we're taking up that full available width. So next we need to update that container section where we've got our contents, because we see now it's kind of overlapping there. So we're going to update that one that has that main, and we're going to treat them as two separate containers. So let's update main as well. I'm going to put a border around it, and I'm going to get rid of these borders, but for now maybe a better way is to create just a border class. And then I'm going to apply this border wherever I need to apply it. So this will save me the trouble. And I want to add this into all of my main containers. So this is just for design purposes. We're not going to actually utilize this, but this is just that we can see where our main containers are being held. So on the header there, on the nav, I'm going to add that in on the main one, and then lastly on the footer. So this presents all of those so we can see exactly where everything is sitting. So when we resize, we see where things are sitting. So now let's go back down into our media area here, and we're going to update this. So we've got the nav is floating left, so that means that the main container area should float right. So float that over to the right, and we see that it's taking up a little bit too much space. So let's try width of 70% so that it stacks nicely there. And remember, again, this is only going to be for the bigger screens. Once we shrink down to the smaller screens, then we've got it presented in the way that we want it to. So maybe this is a little bit too small, so make it a touch bigger there so we can see exactly what's happening there. So we see that we've got kind of a little bit of a mess here, where we've got our copyright is here, we've got this content over here. So we might want to, depending on how many items we have in our navigation menu, we might want it to actually to remove out this entirely and let it stack as expected. But we still are presented with this problem where our navigation is kind of overlapping into our content area. Few choices here, depending on if we want the full width, then we can stay with width 100%, or we could remove out that padding, because it's actually the padding because we're applying it to the list items. So it's got different sectioning than it has where we're actually applying these hyperlinks. So we can make an update to that as well if needed. So we're going back to our main CSS here. We see that we've applied the padding here to the nav A, and we've got some default padding there. So we'd have to make some adjustments to that if we wanted to utilize it. And this is where the media screen gets a little bit tricky, because you actually have to remove out stuff that might be affecting your styling in the different places here. So we've got our padding of 0, so that fixed it slightly. We've added in padding again, so there's probably somewhere else where we do have some padding. So it does take a little bit of playing around. So we do have our unordered lists has padding as well. So I need to bring that one down as well and bring it to 0. So that can get a little bit tricky here, and we can see add that in. So that gets rid of some of that default padding. Now let's take a look at see where else we'd have it. So one of the things here, we notice that it's we're using up a lot of this real estate here, and we generally want our navigation menu to stack properly. So we can simply remove out the padding if we wanted to, and that would save us a lot of trouble on that end. We can also set this to 0, and that would align it into 100% there. And then this is sometimes the problem here when you talk with, when you look at pixels and percentages, that it's really hard to get those aligned. So generally, if you're using percentages, if you're using these fluid values, you might want to look at just having this ability to kind of set these default widths. So maybe we want to only take up 90% because we don't want it going all the way over. We want it to align nicely and so on. So it does take a little bit of playing around and just trying to determine what the best way to present that content would be. So I think that this presents it probably in the best way. But again, if you wanted to use a really long menu, then essentially this is going to be like a 2-column layout. And then you'd have to treat it as such. So you'd have to float this one, all the main content area, over to the right. So this should align with what our design is. So let's take a look at that. And we see that our design originally was to take up that full content area, but because we only have 3 menu items, we're going to shift our content there to stack right underneath that navigation menu. So we're going to just leave that as is and move on to building out some additional styling here. When we're resizing, we've got 2 columns here, and this is where I want to attach that 2-column website feel to it. So I'm going to update these as 2 columns, and we also still have to update our image, because if our image was really big, we could run into potentially some issues when we're resizing. So I want to take care of that as well. So all of this is coming up in the next set of lessons.